Hi, I'm 108 years old now. When you live this long, most of the people who once knew you slowly disappear. Friends first, then neighbors. Eventually, even the people who remember the younger version of you are gone. What's left is mostly quiet. And in that quiet, certain thoughts come back again and again. Things you did, things you didn't do, words you never said. There's something I never told my son. It's a small sentence when you hear it out loud, but it has followed me for almost 40 years. I suppose I'm telling it now, because time has a way of narrowing the road ahead. At my age, you stop pretending there will always be another opportunity. There won't be. My son, Daniel, was born when I was 31. I still remember the morning the nurse placed him in my arms. He was smaller than I expected, his eyes closed tight, like the world was too bright for him. I remember thinking that everything important in my life had just arrived in that small hospital room. At the time, I believed I would always be there for him. Not in the loud, emotional way people talk about in movies. I wasn't that kind of man. I was quieter, practical. I believed being a good father meant working hard, providing, keeping the lights on and food on the table. So that's what I did. I worked at a machine parts factory outside town, the kind of place where the air always smelled faintly of oil and hot metal. The shifts were long, 10 hours most days, sometimes 12 when orders were heavy. But I told myself that was what fathers were supposed to do. When Daniel was young, he used to wait for me by the front window in the evenings. My wife told me about it later. He would press his face against the glass when he heard a car slow down on our street. Most of the time it wasn't me, but sometimes it was. I remember walking in the door and seeing him run across the living room with those small feet slapping against the floor. "Dad's home," he would shout, like it was something exciting. And I would pick him up for a moment before heading to the kitchen. I thought that was enough. Children grow quickly, faster than you realize while you're living inside the days. One year he was learning to ride a bicycle. The next, he was taller than the kitchen counter. I missed more of those years than I understood at the time, not because I wanted to, because I assumed they would always continue. There was always something at the factory that felt urgent. Extra shifts, deadlines, supervisors reminding us how easily jobs could disappear. When Daniel had his first baseball game, I remember promising I would try to make it. But that afternoon, the line manager asked if anyone could stay late. A shipment needed to be finished before morning. I stayed. When I came home that night, the house was quiet. My wife was already asleep. I found a small plastic trophy sitting on the kitchen table. Second place. Daniel had left it there for me to see. The next morning, I told him I was proud of him. He nodded. Children are forgiving in ways adults rarely notice. Years passed like that. School concerts, parent meetings, weekend games. I attended some of them. Not enough, but some. And I told myself that was the best balance a man could manage. Daniel grew into a thoughtful boy, quiet like me. Sometimes I would catch him watching me while I read the newspaper at the table, as if he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how to begin. There was one evening I remember more clearly than the others. He must have been 15. I was sitting in the living room after dinner, still wearing my work clothes. My back hurt from lifting heavy crates all day. Daniel stood in the doorway, holding a piece of paper. I got accepted, he said. It was a letter from a summer art program in the city. A teacher had recommended him. He wanted to go for 6 weeks. I remember looking at the paper for a long time. Art never made sense to me. It felt uncertain, impractical. The world I knew ran on steady paychecks and predictable routines. I folded the letter and handed it back. That kind of thing doesn't lead anywhere, I said. You should focus on something more reliable. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly and walked back to his room. At the time, I believed I had done the responsible thing. Parents guide their children towards stability. That's what I told myself. Years later, I would replay that moment in my mind and wonder what might have happened if I had simply said something different. If I had asked him what he wanted. But life doesn't pause while you reconsider a sentence. Daniel finished school. He studied accounting at a community college nearby. A sensible choice. He found steady work at a small firm across town. From the outside, everything looked fine. He visited on Sundays sometimes. We would sit in the kitchen drinking coffee. Our conversation stayed on safe ground. Weather, work, car repairs. The kind of things two people talk about when neither of them knows how to reach the deeper parts of the conversation. And the strange thing is, I believed we had time. Time to talk later. Time to say the things that mattered. That's the quiet mistake many of us make. We assume the years ahead are wide open. But the truth is, life moves in one direction. And sometimes the words you think you'll say someday never find their moment. If you'd like, I can continue the rest of the story. The years kept moving the way they always do. Quietly. Daniel married when he was 27, a kind woman named Laura. I remember shaking her hand the first time we met in their small apartment. She smiled easily, the way people do when they are still hopeful about how life will unfold. They had a daughter 2 years later, my granddaughter, Emily. By then I was already slowing down. My back had begun to trouble me more often, and the factory work that once felt normal started feeling heavier every year. But retirement was still a few years away, and I kept going. That's what I had always done. Daniel visited less often, once his own life filled with responsibilities. I understood that. It seemed natural. That's how life moves forward. Children grow up and build their own homes, their own routines. Still, there were moments when I noticed a certain distance between us. Nothing dramatic, just a kind of careful politeness. When we spoke, our conversations rarely moved beyond ordinary things. How's work? Busy? How's Emily doing in school? She's doing well. We sat across from each other, like two men who respected one another, but never quite learned how to speak honestly. And I suppose that was my doing. Children learn the language of emotion from their parents. If a father speaks mostly in practical words, that's the language the child grows up understanding. I had spent years talking about schedules, bills, responsibilities, not feelings, not dreams. So by the time Daniel became a grown man, the deeper conversations had already slipped past us. There was one afternoon, many years later, when I came close to saying what had been sitting quietly inside me. It was after I retired from the factory. I remember sitting on the porch of the small house where he had grown up. The paint on the railing had begun to peel, and the maple tree in the yard was much taller than it used to be. Daniel had come by to help me fix a loose step. When the work was finished, we sat together in 2 old chairs. The sun was beginning to set. We talked about Emily's school and Laura's new job. Then there was a pause. Not an uncomfortable pause. Just a quiet moment where neither of us was speaking. I remember looking at him and realizing something strange. He was already older than I had been when he was born. Time had carried both of us further along than I had noticed. And suddenly, I thought about that letter he once held in his hand. The art program in the city. I thought about the way I folded it and gave it back to him. For the first time, I understood something clearly. He hadn't stopped loving art because he lost interest. He stopped because I told him it didn't matter. The realization came late, much later than it should have. I almost said it then. I almost told him that I was wrong, that I should have listened, that maybe his life might have unfolded differently if I had simply supported the thing that made him feel alive. But the words stayed where they were. Not because I didn't want to say them, because it suddenly felt awkward after all those years. I told myself there would be another moment, another afternoon like that one. There usually is, until there isn't. Daniel died when he was 63, a heart attack. It happened early one morning while he was getting ready for work. The call came from Laura. I remember holding the phone and feeling like the room had become strangely quiet. Not loud grief. Just a silence so deep it almost felt unreal. When you are 108 years old, you expect to bury many people, but no parent ever expects to bury their child. At the funeral, I watched Emily standing beside her mother. She looked older than the last time I had seen her. Everyone said the usual things. He was a good man. He worked hard. He loved his family. All of that was true. But while I sat there, listening to the quiet murmur of voices around me, one thought kept returning. I never told him. I never told my son that I was proud of who he became. Not the polite kind of pride people say in passing. The deeper kind. The kind that says, I see you. And there was something else I never told him. I never told him that the decision I made all those years ago about the art program was one of the few things in my life I wish I could change. Maybe it wouldn't have altered anything. Maybe he still would have chosen the same path. But he would have known that I believed in him. That matters more than people realize. Children don't remember every word their parents say, but they remember the ones that shape who they think they're allowed to become. I think about that now more often than I used to, when the house is quiet, when the afternoon light moves slowly across the floor. At my age, most of life exists in memory. And memory has a way of bringing certain moments forward again and again. Not the big ones people talk about, the small ones, a folded letter, a sentence spoken too quickly, a conversation that never quite happened. If you're listening to this, I'm not telling you what to do with your life. I've lived long enough to know that every person walks their own path. But I will say this. Sometimes the words we hesitate to speak are the ones that matter most. And time is not as generous as we imagine when we're younger. I have very little road ahead of me now. That's simply the truth of being 108. Most days I sit by the window and watch the street the way my son once watched from my car when he was a boy. The world continues moving. Children walk past on their way home from school. Neighbors come and go. Life carries on. And every now and then, when the afternoon grows quiet, I think about Daniel standing in that doorway with a piece of paper in his hands. I see the way he looked at me, waiting for an answer. It was such a small moment, just a father and a son in a living room. But sometimes a life turns on moments that small. If this story meant something to you, you're welcome to share your thoughts. I don't need anything from it. At my age, most of the things a man once wanted have already passed by. But perhaps a story like this can sit quietly with someone for a while, the way certain memories sit quietly with me. Because there are some truths you carry for a long time before you finally say them out loud. And sometimes, when you finally do, the person you needed to hear them most is already gone. If this story stayed with you for a moment, you can like the video and subscribe if you'd like to hear more quiet stories like this.